We read in chaos, we read in quiet, we read in an ortus conclusus, we read in the middle of a bombardment. We are reading creatures, and we can't avoid that. Because I don't have a method. There are several ways of thinking and of writing. One is to go from A to B, and the other is to lose yourself before you get to B. One is the system that is used by logicians and by serious thinkers, and the other is the method of digression, the one that, like Little Red Riding Hood, knows that she has to lose herself in the woods in order for there to be an adventure. That's the one I chose. What changes in the methods of reading are the tools that we use for reading, and the prestige or identity that reading has in our societies. The mechanisms of reading depend on the brain, and someone like Marianne Wolf can explain that much better than I can, because she's a neurologist and I'm just a reader. What happens in the brain, as we know, is that we create a neural path for the information on the page to reach us. The information on the screen reaches us in a different way, creates a different neural path. And so the instruments that we use determine the kind of reading we can do. One facilitates reading in depth, and the other facilitates the reading that's a superficial reading, which is not a bad thing, because if you look at a sign that says danger, you have to do a superficial reading. A deep reading is not necessary. At the same time, I think that we read in the social context that we have created. We are living in a consumer society where we are required not to read, simply to react and follow the desire that has been created for us, which is a desire that is never satisfied, which is the basis of commerce after the Industrial Revolution. Nevertheless, reading is a way of capturing, through the instrument of writing, the experience of others. It's a way of eliminating the obstacles of time and space. We have very early testimonies of this. There is a Sumerian letter that has come down to us where the person who has received a letter responds to his friend and says, "Your letter has reached me, and it is as if you were there and I could embrace you," which is a wonderful early reaction, so common to us all today, even more with email. We have also developed from the origins of writing up to now different forms of tackling the identification of the words on the page or a piece of clay or a screen. In the beginning, the first reading, the reading of those first signs that needed to be deciphered, the theory is that they came to us as oral hallucinations. We saw the sign for dog and we heard the word dog as if somebody were pronouncing it for us. It was our brain, of course, that echoes what we see on the clay or the page. And slowly, the possibility of turning that oral hallucination into a silent one became possible. In the beginning, for a number of reasons, neurological, but also because the first words in cuneiform or Greek or Latin were not identified in the sentence. The sentence was presented all together. So it was easier to speak them out loud, to know what was on the text. And around the 9th century, this form of reading becomes less used and silent reading becomes more common. There are indications that silent reading was possible long before the 9th century. The most famous example is the 3rd century. St. Augustine, in his Confessions, says that he was going to Milan. His mother says, "You must visit this old friend of mine, Santo Ambrogio," and the young St. Augustine goes to his study, and the old man was there surrounded with papers and books, but with great surprise, St. Augustine says, his lips were not moving and no sound was coming out of his mouth, but he was obviously reading. Now, curiously, this surprise of St. Augustine should not have surprised him, because he could do the same thing in a very famous scene of his conversion, where he's sitting reading the letters of Paul with a friend in the garden. He hears a child singing outside the garden wall. And the child is singing "Tolle lege," take up and read, which is perhaps a children's song of the time. And so following that instruction, St. Augustine takes up the book, reads in a letter of Paul, "Put on Christ as an armor," and that is the moment of his conversion. But he does this silently, and he shares it afterwards with his friend. So he knew that these two forms of reading were possible. There are many other examples, but they're always examples that denote the exception, silent reading as the exception. After the 9th century, silent reading is common. Daniel Pinnock very intelligently said that the verb to read doesn't bear the imperative. You can't tell anyone, read. It comes from a will of communicating with the world. And this communication is effected in different stages, some simultaneous and some progressive. You are confronted with a text, you may have heard it, somebody reading it to you, you may discover it on your own, you read it silently, if you like it, you want to share it. Sometimes you want to share the moment of discovery with others, so you read in a group. All these are possibilities. The important thing to remember, I think, is the possibility of reading as a common social act, a way of sharing the experience of society in society. Now, it can be done privately, it can be done with a friend, it can be done with a child, it can be done communally. The quality of that reading doesn't depend on the method of reading. the communication that is affected when you rescue the words from the page can be, as I say, individual or communal, and all are important in discovering the experience of the past. The impulse to read doesn't depend on the circumstances. We read in chaos, we read in quiet, we read in an ortus conclusus, we read in the middle of a bombardment. We are reading creatures, and we can't avoid that. So the image that you describe of readers looking at the shelves of a bombed library is indicative of the power of this will to read. But we have recently had the example of being locked in because of COVID, and the impulse to read became much greater. Reading increased statistically when we were locked in, I think because the impulse to read is indicative of the will to communicate with the world. And when we are closed from the world, we want to communicate with the world, and the books and the texts and the screens are the most obvious way of doing that. So reading doesn't depend on quiet circumstances. When Thomas à Kempis said that he chooses a quiet corner to read, that's fine. But we know that people are reading in Gaza today, people are reading in the Ukraine today. These catastrophic situations don't prevent us from reading. I believe that we distrust our own intelligence and our own capacity to be better creatures. We come to the world with a certain intelligence, with a certain curiosity, and in the struggle between the rules of society and our own impulses, many times we lose. We disbelieve in our own intelligence, we disbelieve in our own curiosity, and we relinquish this important part of us, which is the consciousness of these impulses that makes us human. What does it mean to be human? For me, it means to be able to question the world around you. Not necessarily to receive answers. When you confront the world throws questions at you, and those questions can lead to greater questions. There is no final answer unless it's in a catechism, and literature is not catechism. Literature never tells you yes or no, black or white. It opens more questions. But in a society that wants to be domineering, in a totalitarian society, in a capitalist society, in a communist society, all these societies that want to dominate the subjects within that society, there is the impulse to take away that quality that makes us human, because it's much easier to control machines almost, or at least creatures that don't believe in their own intelligence, than someone like the great heroes of humanity, like Boëthius or Einstein, who question the universe. So the idea of humanism that started as a knowledge of the experience of the past, of the classics, of what philosophy and literature presented to us before, has turned into something that is supposed to be opposed to a scientific a way of looking at the world, or even worse, the political way of looking at the world. This is an ancient dichotomy that has never been proven. On the contrary, the will in the Middle Ages to see all the parts of human investigation and knowledge and curiosity as one encyclopedic view of the world that was called humanistic has been degraded to special focuses, so that we now believe that it's more important to study precisely one point, one subject, and forget all the rest, as if anything could exist outside the universal web. The history of reading is a geometric progression. It's not one chapter after the other, but it expands and it goes forward. And when I say go forward, I mean going backwards, going in circles, ascending and descending. There is no particular moment that I wish to relive, because if I were to relive it, I would relive it with the memory of what has taken place before, and the element of surprise would be taken away. There is a wonderful scene in a novel by Thomas Love Peacock, where one of the protagonists is showing a friend the garden that he has laid out. This is in the 18th century. And he shows the friend that if you turn this corner, there is a surprising view, and he calls this the element of surprise. And the friend says, "What do you call it when you go round the second time?" And this is what happens if I look back at my history of reading. The book I wrote is called A History of Reading because it's mine. I know that every reader has his or her own history of reading. And in those histories, there will be different moments of surprise and discovery, and also disappointment. So to go back to your question, if I had to relive a moment in my history of reading, there would be none that I could choose. I would always choose one that's in the future and that I don't know about. Dunque, nel mio malo italiano, direi io ai lettori italiani come a lettori di tutto il mondo che doveste essere vigilante. In nessun momento la pagina è un luogo sicuro. Sempre ci sono dei pericoli intorno a noi e dobbiamo concentrarsi nel testo, la rivelazione che dà il testo, ma anche di quello che succede fuori dai libri, perché questa è la nostra responsabilità e la nostra vita.